dia, bom dia a todas. Uau! Diz, diz... Bom dia a todas, a todos. Eu gostaria de dar as boas-vindas aos estudantes, aos ingressantes, aos veteranos, a todo mundo que nos assiste, ao nosso semestre 2021.1. Eu falo em nome do programa de pós-graduação em Sociologia, e hoje nós vamos ter uma aula inaugural do nosso programa de pós-graduação, Individualism, The Travails of Neoliberalism, com o professor Ralph Fevre, professor emérito da Universidade de Cardiff, no Reino Unido, que vai ser apresentado pelo professor Edemilson Paraná, nosso vice-coordenador. Ele fará sua conferência, sua aula inaugural em inglês. Depois nós podemos abrir o debate com as perguntas que vão ser postas no chat. Muito obrigada, professor. Agradeço enormemente a sua presença, a sua disponibilidade, o seu interesse e generosidade em proferir essa conferência. Agradeço aos meus colegas, Edemilson Paraná, vice-coordenador do curso do programa de pós-graduação em Sociologia, o professor Jackson Aquino, sempre presente aqui nas nossas atividades remotas. Muito obrigada, boas-vindas ao semestre 2021.1.
Muito obrigado, professora Andréia, por essa abertura e pela apresentação do início das nossas atividades e da nossa conferência. Como a conferência vai ser toda feita, né, pelo professor Ralph Fevre em língua inglesa, como disse a professora Andréia, a partir de agora, então, eu passo, então, ao inglês, que vai ser a língua da nossa atividade. So, hi everyone, it's a great pleasure to be here today. I'm Edemilson Paraná, professor of economic sociology and sociology of work at the Department of Social Science at the Federal University of Ceará, and also professor of the graduate program in sociology at the same university. And it's my great honor and pleasure to receive here today at our opening semester conference, Professor Ralph Fevre, who will give us a lecture called Individualism and Travails of Neoliberalism. Ralph Fevre is Emeritus Professor at Cardiff University and Distinguished Visiting Research Professor at Beijing Normal University, and also researcher at the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research and Data, Wizard. Fevre has a BA in Sociology and Economics from the University of Durkheim and a PhD in Sociology from the University of Aberdeen. Has been professor of social research in the Cardiff School of Social Sciences since 1995, after holding teaching and research posts in the University of Wales since 1982. He has served a number of terms as Director of Undergraduate Studies, Director of Teaching and Learning, and Director of Postgraduate Research. Between 2003 and 2005, he served as the Deputy Director of the School of Social Science at Cardiff University. He has been an external examiner at the University of Leicester, University of Liverpool, Royal Holloway University of London, and London School of Economics. Among many other publications, which is a extensive list, he is the author of the books Individualism and Inequality, The Future of Work and Politics, published by Edward Elgar in 2016, and The New Sociology of Economic Behavior, published by Sage, 2003. And his conference today, as I said, it's called Individualism and the Travails of Neoliberalism. And a small, abstract of it would be the following. Much of the success of neoliberalism can be explained by its appropriation of individualism. In the 19th century, egalitarian individualism led to progressive social movements aiming to universalize opportunities for autonomy and self-development. From anti-slavery and extending to universal human rights, these social movements supported the idea that individualism was for everyone, and increased individual freedom went along with increased equality. In this context, education became a means to achieve equality. The process of industrialization, however, introduced competitive economic individualism, which took over and changed the role of education. From being about making good citizens, education became about personal advancement and competition. Expansion of education across the world meant the dissemination of education as human capital. In workplaces, human resource management practices helped to spread ideas that seem progressive, even desirable, such as equal opportunities, equality, and diversity. The ultimate result of these developments was rising inequality throughout the world. It's worth mentioning that this conference is also the opening lecture of our small course called Inequality, Neoliberalism, Individualism, Inequality, that is going to be held by Professor Hal Febvre at the Federal University of Ceará during the following weeks, and is also part of the graduate course that I'm holding together with Hal throughout the semester, which has the same name: Individualism, Neoliberalism, Individualism, and Inequality. Hal, finally, the floor is yours, and you can now begin your conference. Thank you so much for generously accepting our invitation for being here today. It's a great honor and pleasure for us.
Thank you very much for asking me. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Paraná. Thank you, the Federal University of Ceará. And thank you most of all to anybody who's decided to give up a bit of their day to listen to this talk. I hope you think it's worthwhile. And I guess there can't be any of you who haven't realized that the neoliberal model of capitalist growth has run into, well, to put it mildly, a bit of trouble in the last couple of years, from where I'm sitting I'm actually in Wales in the UK, with some of my family in the United States. It's pretty obvious what that trouble has been. The rise of two populist leaders in America and in the UK, who have came to power on a wave powered by a different kind of politics to the politics that had supported neoliberalism over the previous decades. Now this, as I'm going to admit, came to a bit of a surprise to me. I guess I wasn't the only one who didn't predict the victory of the Brexit campaign in the UK and the victory of Donald Trump in the States. There were rather more people who expected the problems of neoliberalism to appear a bit earlier on. This is Alan Greenspan making his famous admission that there seemed to be a flaw in the model, in his ideology, as he put it, of growth. The assumption, the flaw was the assumption that all would be well if you left self-interested organizations like banks to their own devices. And this had gone horribly wrong in the financial crisis. Now, I guess on the left, we expected that to be the problem of neoliberal capitalism, that its inability to sustain itself without government help would be its undoing. And so we watched governments around the world in the most affluent economies bailing out their banks, and yet at the same time enhancing the inequality that neoliberalism had caused. They increased the price of the assets that the rich people had, while making, eventually, the public sector pay the bill for all of that bailout of the banks. Yet, there seemed to be no political penalty. It didn't seem to be the case that there was, yes, there was increased support for Bernie Sanders in the States, and eventually the Labour Party changed their leader in the UK. But it didn't seem that this was the point, after all, at which a serious challenge to neoliberalism was going to come out. However, in the longer term, it turned out that bubbling underneath the water, there were big problems brewing for neoliberalism. Now, unfortunately for me, I published my book in 2016, just before all of that got going. So I failed to predict what those problems would be. I thought, as I've just described, I thought that the political challenges that would cause the most problem for neoliberalism would come from the left, as the parties as left-wing parties in affluent countries tried to find a model which would guarantee increased equality, that would be able to address that seemingly endless rise in inequality that all the people from Barack Obama in the States, Gordon Brown in the UK had said so much about, but failed to do much about. So I thought that yes, it was going to be some sort of response on the left, and I was wrong. Far from it. Not in the UK, not in the US, not in many European countries, not in many South American countries. Nevertheless, I still maintain, and hopefully at the end of the next hour and a few minutes, you won't be. Well, if I haven't persuaded you, at least you'll be able to see the logic of why I maintain that you still need to understand the relationship between neoliberalism and individualism if you're going to understand what juncture we're at and where we're heading. So I think you still need to know about individualism in order to know about the prospects and the problems of neoliberal capitalism. So what I want to do in the rest of my talk is these 7 things. So first I want to talk around some concepts. Obviously, neoliberalism and individualism are top of the list. So let's talk about what they mean. As Parana mentioned in the little abstract at the beginning, which was from a version of this talk I gave a couple of years ago in Porto, are in my analysis, social movements play a very big role in the development of the ideology of individualism. So I'd like to tell you a bit about that. Then I want to tell you about the development of individualism in the United States. And from those 2 discussions, I want to draw a mixture, a kind of a discussion of the kind of individualism that developed out of both of those things, the social movements and the experience of individualism in the US. I'm calling it here a hybrid individualism, because it was that provided political support and legitimacy for neoliberalism as it spread around the world. Not that it became, not that it actually dominated the whole world. In the next couple of sections, I want to describe how in some Asian countries there has been resistance to some aspects of neoliberal capitalism. There are, in particular, there are maybe not the right conditions for that hybrid individualism that took the West by storm to take root. But of course, then we can come back to the West itself, where there have been those recent challenges to the ideology of individualism in the very countries where neoliberalism originated. And then finally, I'll come back for another attempt to do what I did in 2016, see if I can make a better job of thinking about the future of politics. But I warn you, this may be a futile attempt. I've got a feeling I'm not going to say that much different to what I said back then. Maybe if we wait long enough, I'll turn out to be right. So, some concepts. Now, I'm sure you can all think of various characteristics of neoliberalism, privatization, the insertion of private sector management practices into the public sector, quasi-markets introduced into the public sector, into health and so on, anti-trade union legislation, liberalization of labour markets, stricter welfare, a shrinking state. Except that last bit, yes, stricter welfare, monetarism, targeting inflation, all of those things. But that last thing, smaller government, that can be a bit misleading, I think. Even Herbert Spencer, back in the late 19th century, second half of the 19th century, he was the leading philosopher of spreading the ideas of 19th century liberalism around the world, very popular in the United States. Even he thought that you needed the state to have some role. It had to uphold the rules in order to make it possible for capitalism to bring its benefits to everybody, in his in his eyes, those benefits were all about human evolution. But even Spencer thought that the state had to do some rule making. Now, in fact, neoliberalism requires a lot more than that. As I put it on the first bullet point here, the neoliberalism requires the state to dedicate all of its efforts to the maintenance of the environment that neoliberalism needs in order to be able to fulfill its promise of economic growth. So that means everything, all its efforts, what the government does in every one of its departments, in health, in education, in criminal justice, in social security, just as much as in finance and economic development throughout. So you can't do this with necessarily smaller government. You need government which is dedicated to the maintenance of the environment which neoliberalism needs, and that also means very much coordination between states at the international level to ensure that the rules that are made have a global reach. Plus, back in Spencer's time, there was a limited suffrage. Most people didn't have the vote. Neoliberal capitalism requires a much broader platform of political legitimacy than the late 19th century liberal original capitalism did. So it needs liberalism needs the potential. It needs the actions that the state takes, not only to make it safe, a safe environment for it to make profits, for it to do what it does, but also for it to be guaranteed political legitimacy, for there to be political support in a situation of mass democracy and universal suffrage. Of course, there are other rules which don't seem, though I think perhaps things are changing in the UK at the moment, but they don't seem on the face of it to be rules that have obvious political relevance. Things like rules about trade or intellectual property rights. But the kind of rules that I'm thinking particularly of here are those in the third bullet points, the ones that contribute to enshrining individual rights, particularly individual employment rights, so that on the one hand, the state legislates against trade unions and liberalizes labor markets, but in the same act, it reinforces political support by granting individual employment rights. Look, you don't need organized labor. Organized labor is superfluous. Your employer wants to deal with you as an individual. In that way, you will be best rewarded. That also has the effect of disarming wider social movements, which is a point that I'll come back to. So the kind of rules we're talking about are epitomized by those which enshrine individual rights. But as states put those in place, the neoliberal corporations have been able to argue that this is, in many instances, just the state catching up with what they've been doing all the time. They have been valuing employees as individuals, and it's just the states that are now catching up. I'll be coming back to that point. But now I want to tell you a bit about individualism. So having talked around neoliberalism, and I want to talk about individualism. Some of you may have seen this, the latest documentary series by the British filmmaker Adam Curtis called Can't Get You Out of My Head. It's an interesting place to start this discussion, not because Curtis is a sociologist or social scientist of any kind. I mean, he offers us a weird form of analysis, which is it has a unique form of identifying causation using image and music, and also quite often asserting the significance of coincidence. It's not just happening here. Look what's happening there. But he uses that weird form of analysis in order to persuade us three things about individualism. Firstly, that individualism is a defining characteristic of modernity. He talks about the age of individualism. He's also very keen for us to understand that individualism can be dangerous and unpredictable. It's like a firecracker thrown into society with the potential to blow up all sorts of social arrangements, whether it's those of communist China before the Cultural Revolution, or the consumerism of 1960s America, or the Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. So it's ubiquitous, but it's dangerous and unpredictable. And thirdly, it's no good. It leaves us all bereft. We live in an age when we're supposed to work things out for ourselves. We're supposed to make our own way in the world, but actually that makes us really, really anxious. So we focus in on ourselves when we ought to be looking out to society if we want to improve our lives. So I'm not suggesting that you watch that documentary. It's quite long. It's a lot longer than my talk today. It is freely available. You can find it on the internet, but I'm not suggesting you watch it in order to learn why things happen. As Curtis often says things like, well, something X rises up. A new thing doesn't need an explanation because he says, but then, or suddenly. So we don't want to look at it for explanation. Hopefully we can advance a bit more in the way of explanation today. I mean, I think having read an interview of his that I'll mention towards the end of my talk, I do think I now know why he doesn't need these kind of explanations. I think it's because he's quite attracted to complexity theory. So I think the methodology that Curtis employs by selecting all his imagery and his music and stuff is that this seemingly a random array of cultural products is for him a way of showing us complexity from which we can draw patterns. So I think he's seeing himself like some sort of artificial intelligence program, seeing patterns in all of these images and sounds. So that's why he doesn't think I'm going to offer is necessarily required. But sociology has been doing just this kind of thing for an awful long time, since Weber and Simmel. Famously, Weber said, it's all too complex out there for us to come up with one explanation. We need layers of different explanation. Hence, he came up with the idea of an ideal type. You had to apply several ideal types in order to understand complex society. So hopefully it's that tradition that I'm going to be following today. However, if we don't watch Curtis for explanations, it is useful for the way it gives you access to some interesting bits of history, for some, not just he touches on Trump and Brexit. There's quite a lot on social movements. He also extends the idea of politics losing touch to Russia and China, which I'm going to say nothing about Russia and very little about China today. And there are general tropes that crop up in a lot of Curtis's work, which refer to cultural malaise and possible solutions that are actually quite similar to the stuff that I've been thinking about since the book I published 21 years ago now, Demoralization of Western Culture. Having said all of that, the best reason that you could have for watching Can't Get You Out of My Head is so that it makes you think about the different layers of explanation that you can bring to the very idea of individualism. Now, as I've just intimated, Curtis isn't necessarily I think much of a fan of sociology. His go-to social science, whether he's going to blame it or whether he's going to laud it, is always psychology. He knows a lot more about psychology, I think, than he does about sociology, and it's the same in this series. And I guess that's given away by the title. So for Curtis, individualism is a psychological phenomenon. It's a psychological state, a way of being, and which can be much more acute in particular people. So it's a psychological state. But he also talks, as I said at the beginning, about individualism as an epochal state. He talks about an age of individualism, which implies vaguely maybe, but it implies something more sociological. So it wouldn't half help if we had some different terms here so that we're not confusing the two things. So what should we call the psychological state, and what do we call this more sociological thing? Because I would, and I hope I'm going to demonstrate that individualism, sociology has a prior claim over this concept of individualism before we get to the psychology. So there are some obvious contenders for the psychological state that Curtis is thinking about. Should we call it individuality, or maybe individualization? And if we just think about these for a minute, it's a good opportunity to learn some stuff about individualism, which can be useful when we're talking about its relationship to neoliberalism. I wonder whether any of you have seen the Netflix series, The Crown. This is from the first series when Claire Foy is playing the young Queen Elizabeth. And I think you could say that the whole series, the unifying dramatic premise of the whole series, is that the closer the members of the royal family were to the crown, in her case, the Queen, she became the Queen, the closer you were to the crown, the less individuality you were allowed to display. Certainly the less individuality you were required to display. And there's a couple of scenes when, in the early series, when the young Elizabeth is told by the courtiers that that she does not have time to develop, to learn the things she missed out through her schooling, to develop an interest in mathematics or whatever. She has to learn about the Constitution that she's going to be at the center of. That's it. And she does not have room for individuality. The same story is then told in relation to her sister. And into a subsequent, everybody who comes into the family from outside comes across this same blank refusal to recognize people's individuality. So there's no room for discovering yourself if you're born into the royal family, and if you bring into the royal family as some individuality from outside, then that's bound to be trouble. So is individuality the name of the psychological state that Curtis is trying to get at? Well, I'm part persuaded by that, but then I look around at let's say I open my phone and I look at my Instagram feed and I look at the pictures and videos that my family and friends have posted, and I don't know about you, but all of them seem of a type, don't they? People show themselves in happy celebratory situations. They show themselves celebrating birthdays, wedding anniversaries, milestones for their kids. They show themselves enjoying things. After a while, it all begins to kind of look the same, like it's repeating itself. Lots of the photos and videos that I look at on social media seem to be very, very similar. And I'd suggest that means that you can have individualism without individuality. You can have the psychological state, the way of being, without having this burning desire to be original, to be different. So there I'm departing with Curtis, whose examples of this psychological state are, he picks people who are heroic, who are dangerous, who are shocking. He doesn't pick anybody boring and normal to exemplify the psychological state of individualism. But it doesn't leave much room for the rest of us, then, does it? If we can't all be Tupac Shakur, which one of his examples. So, sorry, getting ahead of myself. So I would offer an alternative. The more, of course, it is the more sociological one, this idea of individualization. which was originally popularized a couple of decades ago by Ulrich Beck and Zygmunt Baum and Anthony Giddens. And what those theorists were referring to was the experience of people in societies who had to make up their own lives because they were no longer expected to meet expectations derived from class or gender or other aspects of their role. That kind of fits with the royal family. They've got their role and they've got to occupy it, but individualization describes how it's like for the rest of us. We have to make it up as we go along. And if we think about that, how those theorists introduce the idea, in modern society, you no longer have your expectations of what your life's going to be like dictated by class or gender. You see that idea has very vulnerable sociological ancestors. It takes us back to Turner's talking about the difference between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. And of course, it takes us back to Durkheim and the idea of the organic division of labor, in which in these more complex societies, not everybody was doing the same thing. Traditional role expectations no longer applied. So here we discover the sociological origins of the idea of individualism. And it's not a concept that describes a way of being, it's a concept that describes an ideology that gives us permission, even obliges us to live in the way that Curtis is trying to describe. So individualism is the state of mind of the person who is living in a society which is not held together by tradition, but by the ideology of individualism. In fact, this is, says Durkheim, the only ideology which could hold together a complex and highly differentiated society in which all of us do so many different things. The best account of this is in Durkheim's famous essay about individualism and the intellectuals. And it was written as part of an intervention into the Dreyfus case. But it describes what modern societies have to unite around now that we aren't all doing the same thing, ploughing the fields, and lives are not preordained by gender, class, religion, and so on. So you may remember the Dreyfus case, and you forgive me this little bit of history because we will come back to it, because even though this was more than 120 years ago, its ghosts still are still around, if even in the pages of French newspapers. Anyway, I'll tell you what this bit is about, this picture is about in a minute. So Dreyfus was a Jewish officer in the French army. He's falsely accused of spying for the Prussians. It was never plausible that he was the spy. I mean, the guy who everybody thinks who did it is standing in plain sight all the time, though he was never prosecuted. But because he was Jewish, Zola was an easy target for the political establishment and the senior military people, the generals in the French army. And even though it soon became obvious to people how fragile the case was against Dreyfus, he was found guilty of spying. He was sentenced to solitary confinement on Devil's Island in 1895. And he was only finally exonerated 11 years later. Now, at the time of his sentencing, several French intellectuals, including Émile Zola here, the author of Germinal, wrote to the papers to express, as the others did, their outrage at this miscarriage of justice. Zola had to flee France. He had to go to England to escape imprisonment. And what the establishment, the military and political establishment said about this criticism from the intellectuals, what they said was that those intellectuals were individualists. That was an insult in the minds of the establishment to call them individualists. When Durkheim joined in, he wrote his essay about that term. He called it Individualism and the Intellectuals. and he took on this epithet that had been thrown at them as an insult, to say that it was something that they should be proud of, because when they criticized the establishment, the political and military establishment, were trampling the rights of this one individual, they were actually upholding the finest traditions of the French Republic. And far from being unpatriotic, as the generals were calling them, they were actually upholding the values that had made the French Republic, had made the French Revolution. So, I mean, that's an interesting irony, isn't it? That this original sociological idea of the ideology of individualism comes out of the mouths of right-wing nationalists and military nationalists, both inside and outside the army. So Durkheim embraced the slur of being called an individualist. He said that the intellectuals were defending the rights of individuals, which had been promulgated since the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, Kant and Rousseau, that were being endangered by this swing to nationalism and the right. This was the intellectuals. This was threatening the very foundations of the Republic, which was that all human beings were treated equal, whether they're Jewish or not. That regardless of individual characteristics, everybody should be treated the same, and that was why they were better defenders of the French Republic than the generals. The generals were saying, you individualists are putting yourselves above the interests of the state. That was, whereas Durkheim is arguing that the idea that all human beings mattered was the core idea of the Republic, the core of the ideology of individualism. It's important because it's approved by all of society. So I've got another quote here I didn't put on the slide. Durkheim said, because this idea of all human beings mattering, because and that's at the center of the idea of individualism, that acquires moral supremacy because it, quote, it raises it far above private goals and thereby gives it a religious character. So having the approval of all of society makes it like a religion. And we'll explore this relationship between religion and ideology as we go through Durkheim's account. So all of us get our moral beliefs from society. You can be an individualist, and for Durkheim, that's a good thing, and it's a step on the road to socialism. But nevertheless, you can be an individualist while also seeing the individual as a product of society. So the generals just have it completely wrong when they think that an individualist is putting one person ahead of social cohesion. It's the other way around. Society puts the sacred nature of the individual at the top of our priorities. It's society that's doing that. So we the intellectuals who defend individuals like Durkheim, we are doing what society wants us to do. But Durkheim knows that there are other ideas of individualism around. There's Herbert Spencer, I mentioned him earlier, who talks of a very selfish individualism. Durkheim says, yes, that has little or no morality. It's not that kind of individualism that holds the individual together. If you forgive me, I read this fairly long quote. It's the longest quote that I've got in my presentation. From Individualism and the Intellectuals. Durkheim says, if the dignity of the individual derived from his individual qualities, one might fear that he would be become enclosed in a sort of moral egoism that would render all social cohesion impossible. But in reality, he receives this dignity from a higher source, one which he shares with all men. If he has the right to this religious respect, it is because he has in him something of humanity. It is humanity that is sacred and worthy of respect, and this is not his exclusive possession. It is distributed among all his fellows, and in consequence he cannot take it as a goal for his conduct without being obliged to go beyond himself and turn towards others. The cult, right, and religion, the cult of which he is at once both object and follower, does not address itself to the particular being that constitutes himself and carries his name, but to the human person, wherever it is to be found and whatever form it is incarnated. Impersonal and anonymous, such an end soars far above all particular consciences and can thus serve as a rallying point for them. Stephen Lukes introduced the English translation of Individualism in the Intellectuals when it was published in a journal. And he makes a great deal of the religious elements in this account. He draws our attention to the idea of the cult of the individual, whose wishes and feelings must be respected, the sacredness of the individual. And it isn't a surprise, really, because Durkheim does think that this idea has religious roots. But Lukes wants us to go further than that. He says, the relevance of Durkheim's essay to the study of ideology lies in his sociological conception of individualism as a set of operative ideals, moral beliefs and practices, indeed as a religion. That's a quote from Durkheim, a system of collective beliefs and practices that have a special authority, which he treats as a social product like all moralities and all religions, and sees as peculiarly adapted and functional to his own society, though the sentiments underlying it are weakened by every violation of an individual's rights. And we're going to be talking about this kind of general area over the next few minutes, but just to stop here for a minute, when he says that when Durkheim says that it's adapted and functional to his own society, that's the point about living in a highly differentiated society. Next division of labour, we don't have anything in common like we used to do in terms of religion or what we do for a living. So what we have in common is our humanity. And the bit at the end, sentiments underlying it are weakened by every violation of an individual's rights, of course, hence the significance of the Dreyfus case, hence why Durkheim thought he had to stand up to the right-wing nationalists who were saying that the authority of the army should never be criticised. But of course, that is what they were saying, that individualism means setting everyone up as the sovereign judge of everything. And there had to be some judgments, like the judgments of the generals, which must be beyond criticism. Durkheim says there is no reason of state which can excuse an outrage against the person when the rights of the person are placed above the state. This makes him both militant in respect of individualism. It gives him the courage to go into print alongside the other intellectuals, but it also makes him quite confident of the future of individualism. So the nation has been defined by the defense of the rights of individuals. So defending Dreyfus means acting in the interest of society. The whole of society is going to be threatened unless you do that, unless you stand up for this single individual. So that makes Durkheim think that ultimately individualism can't be defeated. We would have to prevent men from becoming increasingly differentiated from one another, reduce their personalities to a single level, bring them back to the old conformism of former times, and arrest in consequence the tendency of societies to become ever more extended and centralized, and stem the unceasing growth of the division of labor. Such an undertaking, whether desirable or not, infinitely surpasses all human powers. Well, it's nice to be optimistic, but as we'll see, the ghosts of the generals who sent Durkheim to Devil's Island are still around, and we'll be rethinking at the end whether really Durkheim's optimism is misplaced or not. I think I've taken a little bit too long on that first section. Maybe I should get a move on. So I wanted to talk to you next about the contribution of social movements. ideology of individualism, and that entails making another nice distinction here. So we've already heard that Durkheim didn't want us to think that his kind of individualism was the same as Spencer and the utilitarians, egotism, selfish individualism. So what should we call it? Let's call it moral individualism, because that's certainly what Durkheim thought. That it was a morality, indeed, you know, a crossover with religious morality. So I argue in my 2016 book that the history of Great Britain, just across the English Channel from France, of course, suggests how moral individualism took root across the wider public in the UK through the activities of social movements. The most important example of which is the struggle against the slave trade, but this then provided a template which is followed in subsequent social movements. For example, the next one up was the campaign against child labour. In fact, there was a direct read across. Some of the same people who were involved in the one campaign were involved in the other campaign. Very often, direct comparisons were made between the situations of the slaves and the situations of children working in the factories and down the mines. The interesting thing for me about learning about the 19th century diffusion of moral individualism is that you can see how it did have religious roots, but it also had secular roots as well. So that within moral individualism, there are two kinds of individualism. So yes, of course, there were those in the abolitionist movement who were active against the slave trade because they believed everybody, slaves included, had a soul, that human life was a gift from God. Many of those are obviously Wilberforce, but other leaders of the movement were Quakers. There were people with strong religious convictions, but there were also those without them. And for them, those who contributed to the anti-slavery movement without drawing on religious belief, they drew on other kinds of belief rather than religious ones. For example, beliefs about the capabilities and potential of all human beings and the fundamental rights that we all had as human beings when we're born. So we need some way of describing these two different kinds of moral individualism, and it's pretty obvious that one can be called religious individualism. I want to call, as I did in my 2016 book, I want to call the other one, the secular version, sentimental, because it refers to sentiments, to taking feelings seriously. And both components of moral individualism were part of the mainstay for 19th century progressive social movements. They were powered by a belief that that all human beings deserve freedom and autonomy. And the campaign against the slave trade, it's really actually remarkable to revisit the history. How it grew into a mass social movement without mass means of communication. I mean, yes, people produced pamphlets, but it was through mass meetings, through pamphlets. It organized not just mass meetings and protests, but boycotts of particularly the sugar produced by the slave plantations. And the support for this movement was genuinely diverse. It included an awful lot of people from the working class who themselves had limited amounts of self-determination. This was long before universal suffrage in the United States. Yet huge numbers of working class people boycotted the selling sugar, came to the mass meetings, agitated for the abolition of the trade in slaves. So just as maybe not as important as the abolition of the slave trade, but just as interestingly, the movement itself had two effects: one on the abolition of the slave trade, but the other on the diffusion of these moral ideas amongst the wider population, where it could be drawn on by subsequent social movements, and not just the campaign against child labour, the campaign for factory education, the British Chartists who demanded political rights, the later labour movement. You go into the 20th century with the women's movement, the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland. All of these movements promoted the growth of beliefs about the limitless potential of human beings. And they said they didn't have social media, they didn't have mass media. They did, however, have some good PR people. I'll give you an example of some of their public relations. So not particularly to do with the slave trade, but certainly to do with the abolition of child labour and factory education. So one of the most famous PR public relations people appointed by the 19th century social movements was Charles Dickens. He wasn't appointed, of course. He wrote extremely well-known novels, but those novels, serialized as they were in the popular press, helped to spread these ideas through the population. And this is maybe not an obvious choice. I mean, I could have picked other novelists as well, Charles Kingsley, but I think that Dickens is particularly interesting when he's writing about about children. And this is in his novel Hard Times, which introduces a character called Gradgrind, who is a caricature of a utilitarian. He doesn't believe he doesn't believe in belief. He recognizes only things that can be evidenced. That so Louisa, his daughter, her whole education was about being taught accomplishments, taught skills, taught facts, having a head full of facts. What she didn't have, Dickens explains to us here, was the tender light of fancy. She wasn't taught to approach reason with this through the tender light of fancy as a beneficent God, deferring to gods as great as itself, or was set above everything as a grim idol, cruel and cold, with its victims bound hand and foot, and its big dumb shape set up with a sightless stare, never to be moved by anything but so many calculated tons of leverage. I pick that example because it's worth coming back to when I tell you a little bit about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Child, but also because it's a very good introduction to the discussion of individualism in the United States. So we need to describe what kind of individualism is set up by that grim idol of reason. What kind of individualism does the utilitarians, Herbert Spencer, or the fictional Mr. Gradgrind, what kind of individualism do they believe in? Durkheim, we know already, called it selfish. Later on, John Dewey, writing in the 1930s, would refer to it as economic individualism. Still later, John Mayer, the new institutionalist in sociology of education, called it American standardized individualism. Now, all of those, the selfishness, the economic bit, the fact that it's American, all of those grasp something about it. But I think we need a more umbrella term that allows us to bring together all of those different types of individualism. So we know they're not to do with beliefs. They're not to do with belief in the human soul or a belief in people's kind of capabilities, despite no evidence of them being able to achieve them. That we believe that slaves are as good as us, even though in their current situation they have no freedom. So what else are we going to call it but cognitive individualism? Individualism which requires a demonstration of evidence. And if we call it that, we've now got three types of individualism to use in our explanations: religious, sentimental, and cognitive. The first two do not require evidence. They do not require knowledge. They and the cognitive individualism does. Why am I talking about it in relation to the United States? Because it really got going there far more than it did in the US. But that's not to say that it didn't. That in the US there was unmixed cognitive individualism. Far from it. As I said at the beginning, we need more than one layer of explanation to understand. We need ideal types. So we need all three of these versions of individualism if we're going to understand what happened in North America. I certainly those British social movements, for example, we know it took until the Civil War till there was a challenge to slavery. The campaigns against child labor in the United States didn't really get going into the 20th century. But they did have other things. They had their own American Revolution, a history of civic republicanism, and that had given them elements of moral individualism with both secular and religious components that Durkheim would recognize. There were all those freedoms enshrined in the Constitution, but along with that, American civic republicanism required that Americans learn virtues, including obligations to each other, virtues in relation to economic dealings, and all that underpinned community solidarity. I mean, this was most famously written about by Michael Sandel. So the idea is that you would have community solidarity as well as individual freedoms, much as Durkheim imagined. Of course, none of that extended to plantations. This was not for the slaves. But 19th century America didn't lack social movements either, not entirely. The most important, when I talk about in my book, is the Common Schools movement, which was the movement for public education, which was a good example of how this mix of individualism worked out in the States. The importance of public education was not people acquiring qualifications in order to get better jobs, in order to compete with each other, because in the agrarian republic, most people were farmers or working in agriculture industries related to agriculture. So you didn't require qualifications. What you required was the virtues, the religious and secular virtues that were needed to make the republic function. And a lot of the Common Schools movement was about teaching those virtues to immigrants, mostly from Europe. What that gave the United States was an education system far in advance of most of Europe, and it overtook the expansion of education, earlier expansion of education in Germany. Fine, until then the agrarian republic does industrialize, and then immigration happens on a much larger scale. And at that point, you get a change in the balance of these different kinds of individualism, a much more competitive individualism, with a cognitive individualism pushing out of the way the stuff about creating virtues. And this is what John Dewey was then writing about in the 1930s, looking back to a short period in American history, the progressive period, when it looked as if there might be some way back from this, but actually thinking, no, we're on the road to a new individualism, which is self-interested and recognizes economic rather than moral interests. And so in the education system, you could see that it was no longer important to make people good citizens about who could help their community develop, take their part in decisions about the community. Education wasn't in the interest of the community at all. It was interested in personal advancement. So you get that particularly American development, the idea of competing over educational qualifications, which leads many years later in the 1960s to Gary Becker and Theodor Schultz coming up with the idea of human capital. But here, back in the 1930s, it's what Dewey is describing. It really out there in American societies, people treating education as an investment for their individual advancement, and so you get the competitive, the typical American competition over how many qualifications, how long spent in education. The value of a degree goes down because everybody's got one, so you need a postgraduate qualification and so on. Meanwhile, in Europe, that's not the case at all. The rate of expansion of education slowed. Education's highly stratified. There's very little opportunities for the working class. Now, I hope you've got from that the way the education system in the United States developed illustrates the difference between the earlier sentimental and religious, i.e. moral individualism, and its development into cognitive individualism. It's cognitive because it's an individualism that requires evidence of children's achievements, the results of public examinations, particularly. For John Mayer and his colleagues, the neo-institutionalists, for them, this is what individualism means. It means that system that was put in place in the United States. They call it the public institutionalization of the individual life course. Those stages that we all go through, from kindergarten education through to through employment and eventually to retirement. And at each point, at each stage, at each milestone, we acquire evidence of how we've performed, of what we've done, of our attendance, of the examinations that we've passed. And then when we get into a job, then we acquire evidence of our achievements. I was looking around earlier on. I've got a thing for holding up a bookend for holding up my books, which is actually an award that I got for teaching. And once upon a time, university teachers did not get awards for teaching, maybe because they were also bad at it. And I'm not expecting you to believe that I actually deserve this award, but it's just an example of all of the things that will now get the accumulated range of evidence, all the certificates for professional training and developments, the people's results of their personal appraisals, their personal development reviews, and the awards. And in higher education, there's all sorts of teaching appraisals and research assessments. More and more accumulation of evidence of your progression through the individual life course. And this didn't happen in the UK and in Europe until much later on. It didn't really get going until the 1970s, because really it was only at that point that the education systems in the UK, for example, had caught up with what the Americans had been doing in the common schools movement, so that there was universal freely available education to everybody. So at that point, it was kind of believable that you would be saying that everybody had a chance of competing for qualifications, whereas beforehand, the working class just didn't get access to schools unless they were vocational. Also at this point, of course, in the 1970s, that was the transition, the beginning of the transition to a service sector economy with a small manufacturing sector, fewer blue-collar jobs, beginnings of the journey away from economic nationalism towards globalization and yes, neoliberal capitalism. But the US was already well along that road, so that the UK and other European countries were following the US pattern of increasing the number of jobs which required qualifications once you had public education, which made that possible. So cognitive individualism was becoming a reality in many people's lives for the first time in the UK in the 1970s. And incidentally, the mid-1976 was the highest point of equality in terms of income equality reached in the UK. And it was from that point on that the inequality increased. The point is that political developments, most notably approval of all the changes towards neoliberalism at the ballot box, had to be put in place now at the end of the 1970s, and they wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for cognitive individualism catching up very quickly with what had happened earlier on in the States. Okay, now that doesn't actually give us, that gives us the prelude to neo-individualism. There's my teaching award, by the way, deserved or not. This hybrid individualism I talked about, which provided political support and legitimacy for neoliberal capitalism. I mentioned I would talk about the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. I think I'm getting slightly ahead of myself. Let's leave that slide there for a minute. So by the time we get to the 1970s in the UK and slightly earlier in the US, you know, it's obvious that the economic individualism that Dewey had bemoaned, the increased competition between people over cutthroat competition over credentials, all of that had been in place for some time. But now, in the post-war period, it was softened by the reappearance of other goals which were nurtured by the corporations. And to some people who were writing about this early on in the 70s and 80s, like Ali Hochschild, it seemed for a while as if the community, the missing community, the family that had been lost, you know, way back, you know, the time that Dewey was thinking of, that is being actually replaced by the corporation. The corporations are beginning to say to people that this is where you will be valued, not in the dysfunctional family or the soulless or dangerous neighborhood. The corporations begin to say that their individuals are their most important resource, which is was kind of like the thing that the 19th century social movements were saying about people's limitless potential and everybody mattering. And the neoliberal corporations, these early neoliberal corporations begin to promise to their employees that they will develop their capacities and interests. And as time goes by, as the years go by, particularly for employees with higher education, this promise of developing your capacities and interests becomes quite elaborate. It involves elements of self-expression, of self-actualization. Now, remember what I said earlier about anti-trade union legislation and the importance of individual employment rights and the corporations saying, yes, now this is just states putting in place what we've already done. Well, exactly so. The corporation is saying you don't need a union because you are a most important resource. We treat everybody the same. We help everybody to develop their potential. If you don't do that, if you forego your individual employment relationship, you'll be lumped in with a lot of people with very different capacities and interests. How is that any good for you? And in order to help you, the corporation is in order to show that the corporation means what it says about applying this, the valuing of employees to everybody, they begin to back ideas like equality of opportunity, equality of treatment. If you're our most important resource, then at least in theory, that has to apply irrespective of gender, race, ethnicity, nationality. So the neoliberal corporation claims to have enacted the changes the social movements could only agitate about. Everybody's going to be treated the same. So as part of their servicing of the environment, the neoliberal corporations require, governments have to back all this up. They have to back it up with legislation which will replace collective bargaining with legislative underpinning for individual employment rights. But of course, they've got to back it up with support for equal opportunities and human rights as well. That, of course, helps to take the sails out of the wind behind the wind out of the sails of the remaining social movements that are concerned with those same things. Finally, we get to this slide, to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So here we are, not individual employment rights, not equal opportunities, but the Universal Declaration of the Rights of the Child, which is interesting because it starts off with, first of all, in 1959, with the every child's right to free and compulsory, at least in the elementary stages, education. So basically, what the common school movement in the US had agitated for in the mid 19th century. So everybody's got to have that in the 1959 version. So that's what's necessary for cognitive individualism to get going. In 1989, that was added to. So free and compulsory primary education, secondary education available to all at no cost or with a subsidy were necessary, and access to higher education for all who had the ability. So that's beginning to look a bit more like America in the early 20th century, where you're going to be able to have competition between levels of credentials that people achieve. But also the 89 iteration defines the goal of education provision not just for something for the state to do, but for the individual child. The individual child's personality, talents, and mental and physical abilities have to be developed to their fullest potential. And that's not cognitive individualism, that's sentimental individualism. That's trusting that all of us have potential that can be developed. And there is a universal right for that to happen. So what we have on that page is an example of the hybrid individualism that was taken around the world with the spread of neoliberalism, in the form of a UN declaration, but also in the employment practices of the neoliberal corporations, particularly in the development of the education systems of countries around the world. So the well-educated people who benefited most from this, maybe not as much as from the elites, had a very good reason then for approving neoliberalism, because they could benefit from it materially, but also it was helping to put in place the human rights that they approved of, and this was also a good way of finding a way to live with inequality. Because if you benefited from the privilege, if you benefited from the equality, then that was fine, because everybody had been given a fair chance. We had legislative underpinning for individual rights, and if you with a higher income, well, that was probably because you deserved it. And this is a perfect example of the politics of something like the New Labour Party in the UK, perhaps En Marche in France now. So education is seen as the core of that politics. Globalism is a good thing. It brings with it human rights, and politicians can make an offer to get votes to these sophisticated individuals, because they say that the politicians say they'll support their rights, but they'll also make it possible for them to take advantage of the education, of this advanced education system. And in the UK, that helped New Labour to get elected three times in a row. Tony Blair famously say that it was all about education, education, education. And and that got them elected. And just before the financial crisis, I was involved in a couple of British surveys which show us an extraordinary level of support, really, for the political economy that couple of decades of neoliberal politics had created. So if we look at these very quickly now, the analyses of a couple of British surveys show us that roughly 6 out of 10 employees, so this is just before the financial crisis, trusted neoliberal institutions, including corporations, to deliver individualism. So, for example, 2008, eve of the financial crisis, the Fair Treatment Survey shows 6 out of 10 workers thought they knew enough about their rights. 6 out of 10 employees said the needs of the organization did not always come before the needs of the people. 6 out of 10 said where I work, people are treated as individual. If you remove the neutral option, so that people had to either choose that as a yes, no, that rose up to 8 out of 10 in another survey. So 80% of people thought that they were treated as individuals. Isn't that surprising, don't you think? In terms of, when you think about the alienation, that's the demeaning, the dangerous work that we thought of in terms of working capitalism, 80% approval is spectacular proof of how persuasive the neoliberal settlement was. And there are, backup questions to explore that in detail. It's the high percentages of people saying that they had some say over the way they worked and whether they got respect they deserved from their colleagues. They had a choice in deciding how they did their work. So clearly, capitalist institutions have done a good job of persuading lots of employees. They're not necessarily the unemployed, not necessarily the retired, or the owners of small businesses, and come back to them, that individualism is really safe for them. Now, I want to add to that, however, some qualitative data. So on the face of it, 6 out of 10 being, more conservative, 6 out of 10 people think that capitalist corporations provide a safe, promote the idea, support the idea of individualism. It's a safe place for individualism to prosper. But more recently, after the financial crisis, we have had a program of qualitative interviews with graduates now. So graduates who are millennials, so born in the 1980s, mostly in 5 countries: Portugal, US, UK, Singapore, and China. And this is written up in an article in the Review of Education published last year. And the comparative focus allows us to see something about the differences in the reception of neoliberal ideology of individualism in different countries around the world. Now, we would certainly, for interviewing graduates, we would expect them to be amongst the 60% or so who have been who think that they are treated as individuals. And indeed, they do say that in their interviews. They say that it's the workplace rather than the school or the university that has offered them the best chance of being treated as individuals. That even applies where they're working in high commitment, high intensity workplaces where people are driving themselves to work harder. So it seems that everybody can agree that there are neoliberal workplaces are promoting individualism. But the problem is they don't agree on what individualism consists of. So when you ask them how is it that your employers treat you as individuals, you get extraordinary variations in what people mean by this. So, for example, in an interview in Boston in the US, a guy told us that he was being treated as an individual because he was allowed to wear what he wanted to work on a Friday. He might be doing telesales, but he had some discretion over what he wore. In Cardiff, in the UK, another call centre worker said they were treated as an individual because they had some discretion over what music was played at work. Also, they could finish early on a Friday and go for a drink with colleagues. On the other end of the scale, you get the highly skilled engineering company employee who'd worked in Amsterdam, was now working in Portugal, who expected and was, indeed, his employer lived up to this. His employer helped him to get postgraduate degrees, to learn different languages, to develop transferable skills that would allow him to move on to other employers. So it's precisely because employees don't have a fixed idea of individualism, that they can see it everywhere. Why is that? Why do they have those expectations? Well, because that's what their employers have told them. The employers have told them they are their most important resource, that they are going to be treated as individuals. And yes, we duly find them saying, well, that must be the case. It reminds me, actually, one of those surveys there, we used to involve some questions about health and safety policy. It was a part of the learning what people knew about their individual rights. And we did a test of our questions, a field test of our questions before we put the survey into the field. And so we did intensive interviews with people to find out what they thought of the questionnaires. And one of the questions was, does your employer have a health and safety policy? And without exception, everybody we talked to said, yes, of course our employer has a health and safety policy. And then we would say, have you read it? And they'd never read it. Have you seen it? No, they'd never seen it. Well, maybe they'd seen it. Well, they couldn't remember where. So perhaps they hadn't seen it. So how did they know that their employer had a health and safety policy? Well, they must have. They must have. They're a good employer. That's what they do. They look after us. Of course, they must have a self. It's the same thing. Of course, they must be treated as individuals, because that's what they tell us that they do. That has proved a very attractive political sell over a couple of decades. As I said, it underpinned the success of New Labour and obviously subsequent Conservative governments in the UK. But it's had a little less success in some Asian countries. So I won't spend very long on this. But again, this is covered in that article in the Review of Education. So that what you get about education, competition in education in Asian countries. Here I'm thinking, for example, of Singapore, which we did our interviews in, but the same thing would apply to Taiwan and China. In fact, a lot of countries where you've got Chinese or a population of Chinese migrants. I think what you've got here appears to be competition over education on steroids. I mean, it's a very limited transplantation of the American individualism, because it seems to be just the cognitive part of it, and with very sentimental individualism. So I think if you just look at Singapore, for example, the graduates we interviewed saw working hard to get a good job as an expression of Asian values, not of Western neoliberal ones. Several of them referred to the familiar idea of the tiger parent, which is a trope applied to Asian values, which the idea that parents of Chinese kids drive them to achieve, particularly in education. Singaporean graduates said, well, they weren't really competing; they were just trying to excel, because they didn't want to contradict the official ideology of the ruling party in Singapore, which is more collectivist. But curiously, they didn't think that Western values were all about neoliberal individualism. For them, Western values were much more permissive. They weren't about competition at all. Their Western parents were thought to be relaxed and permissive, and didn't get their kids to achieve at school in the same way that the Asian parents did. On the face of things, from our other interviews in the other countries, they were right about the relaxed and permissive attitudes. For example, when it came to extracurricular activities, not just what people did at school, American, British, Portuguese parents offered more autonomy, and they were less structured, less results oriented in their offers than those in Singapore. But as we've just seen in the previous section, this idea of people developing themselves in extracurricular activities which are less structured is part of that hybrid individualism. The the way in which people are encouraged to express themselves, to explore their self-development. And that is remarkably missing, self-evidently missing in the interviews that we undertook with our Asian graduates. So much so is the emphasis on self-development, on imagination, on self-expression, has it been missing in Asian cultures, that there are now, starting earlier on in Singapore, but here now in the slide in China. This is a mall in Shijimen in Beijing about 18 months ago on a Saturday morning. And if you can see the slide on the left, that's a fairly typical kind of extracurricular activity you might expect in an Asian country. It's all about learning English. But if you look at the next slide there, you see this is a commercial firm, of which commercial outfit, of which there must have been 20 or 30 on this one floor of the mall, offering different kinds of training. Okay, some of it what you might expect: musical education, education in dancing, the English, the playing with robots. This second slide, actually, it shows you the progression that you put your kid through if you sign them up for their Saturday classes here. At ages 3 to 4, they will be taught, they will have their imagination stimulated. Ages 4 to 5, it's exploration. Ages 5 to 6, cooperation. 6 to 8, it will be logical thinking, and 8+, science and technology. But then you look around the rest of the mall and you see something quite remarkable. This is, as opposed to extracurricular activities in other countries where, you know, there's that freedom for the kids to choose, and they do a lot of it themselves. Here, the parents are involved. The parents come with their kids to the mall. Of course, the parents are paying for them. What they're paying for them to play. If you look at the slide on the right, you can see, yes, of course, there are toys for sale, but there are also mothers and fathers sitting down playing with their children. The Chinese state is really worried that the emphasis on educational achievement in China is causing a productivity problem, in that the imagination and creativity is so underestimated in the education system. It's then devalued in the workplace, so that you end up with these commercial solutions to teach Chinese families how to have their kids learn to play. There, as I said, 20 or 30 firms doing all sorts of different aspects. Sometimes making things, handicrafts. Sometimes just playing. These preschool kids just playing, doing wet play there on the right hand side. So I would say more about the social movements. Let me just say this, that I think that the reason the commercial solutions have to be found in the Asian countries are because they do not have the history of social movements, which made sentimentalism, individualism, so much part of the culture of the wider culture of the British and even the American population. And in Portugal, for example, with the political history of Portugal in the last 30 or 40 years, the Carnation Revolution, so social movements encouraged the diffusion of these ideas amongst the population in a way that, you know, for obvious reasons in China, social movements are not allowed to do. And you know, some interesting differences in the literature between the attitudes of parents in Hong Kong, where until recently, of course, social movements were very much alive and kicking, and social movements in China and Singapore. I ought to move on, though, to to the place where we started with the challenges to Western countries where neoliberalism originated. So we've seen that 60% of the working population, at least before the financial crisis, were happy enough. But what about the other 40%? And here I'd like you to just allow me to tell you a little bit about Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she talked about people who were left out of ordinary politics, as the masses who would then be recruited to totalitarian social movements. The reason being that because the world as it was described by the elite to these people didn't make sense. This meant that it was difficult for them to distinguish between truth and fiction. But just generally, let me apply this to neoliberalism. A world in which people are achieving through getting into education, and particularly higher education, doesn't make sense if you're excluded from it. Doesn't make sense if you don't know how to play the game of cognitive individualism. And these potential supporters, as Arendt describes it, potential supporters of totalitarianism found common ground only in a revolt against that, what they were told about how their societies ran. And this, for her, this was this had a structural cause: the economic crises, the multiplication of the unemployment figures, so that people were no longer had a class position, had lost their social status, and therefore rejected common sense. I'd like to say a bit more about Arendt, but I think I'm going over time. Let me just say that in the last decade, we've seen a serious challenge to a politics based in the appeal of individualism. And while we don't have totalitarianism in Europe, we do have a serious challenge, whether it's Brexit or Viktor Orban or well, let me give you the example I wanted to tell you about: the ghosts of the Dreyfus case. Here are French generals again, this time retired French generals, writing to the papers a couple of weeks ago in April, saying that they're being the republic is being betrayed. Islamists are taking over whole parts of the nation's territory. France is threatened by, quote, Islamism in the halls of the banlieue, which are the immigrant suburbs around the French cities. The generals blamed anti-racism for splitting up communities and seeking to create a racial war by attacking statues and other aspects of French history, because Black Lives Matter, presumably. And they're asking, and indeed Marine Le Pen and her party backed the letter calling on the generals to join her in the battle for France. It was followed up a couple of weeks later by another letter from the military. This one was signed by serving junior officers who said that, you know, they respected what their elders had said and they were entirely on their side. This is just a selection of the stuff they were saying. You know, they've offered their skins to destroy the Islamism you are making concessions to on our soil. We saw with our own eyes the abandoned suburbs, the accommodation of delinquency. We've endured the attempt to instrumentalize several religious communities for whom France means nothing but an object of sarcasm, contempt, and hatred. There's lots more of this. Seen as, oh yes, and it isn't just in France. It's very similar stuff to the what we heard from the people who stormed the Capitol and did not believe that that Donald Trump had lost the election in the United States. So, do we think that Durkheim was right to think that individualism was always win out in the end? I think the fact that actually I'm really going to cut a lot of that out. As I said, the last time I tried to make predictions, I was caught out by events I didn't foresee. And now, in the middle of a global pandemic, there are some extra difficulties for seeing what could happen next. So, for example, in Britain, we've had massive public spending, isn't it? The latest count on income support, for example, 55 billion at the top there, which would have been anathema to neoliberalism in the US. Biden signed his $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill. On the other hand, a lot of this public money, look at the bottom left-hand corner there, a lot of this public money is going in to support businesses. Perhaps this is just the state doing what it did in the financial crisis, going the extra mile to do whatever is necessary to keep the show on the road. But then in the UK and the US, some of that money has gone not to international banks, but to small businesses. And again, some of that has gone to small businesses and individuals who are cronies of the government. So there's a bit of corruption involved in that too. And Curtis points that out, actually, that it's not just in the UK that the pandemic has exposed a lot of corruption. The other thing Curtis reckons is that the pandemic has exposed inequality. And it's no longer politically acceptable at the moment in the UK to say that poverty is a choice that an individual makes. It's up to them. That's no longer acceptable because the implications that has for the state's ability to deal with the pandemic. Still, we're waiting to see what policies will actually change as a result of that. We have had some regional policies that look a bit like what we had back in the days of economic nationalism, with a little bit of renationalisation. On the other hand, the UK government's desperately trying to renegotiate trade deals to reinvigorate globalisation. But all of that's way outside my level of expertise. What I want to finish off is by talking about Durkheim's unshakable faith that there's an unstoppable tide of differentiation, which means that in the end, individualism is going to spread out to include more and more people. Oh, he was very optimistic, wasn't he? I mean, when you think about it, those 74 million plus 46.8% of the votes cast, 74 million people who voted for Trump. They're hardly proof of the unstoppable tide of individualism so long after the Dreyfus case. The Conservative Party in England, at least, is very secure in power, gaining at the latest elections. The left in the UK and elsewhere in Europe have had their contradictions brutally exposed, relying on the votes of middle class graduates and unable to respond to the rising inequality that had gone with neoliberalism and had hit their traditional base the hardest. So the appeal of the ideology of individualism has always been limited to those who saw it as reason, who could see how it helped to make their place in the world predictable. And for the left in France, in the UK, a lot of the support was people who had voted out of tradition, who didn't vote at all, gave support by silent assent until they were presented with an alternative, like the Front National in France, or which is now National Rally, or the Brexit. So in the longer term, will people like that stop voting? That 40% who never approved of it, who never could see the sense in it. To think that, as Hannah Arendt said, is a dangerous assumption. She referred to those masses who became the supporters of totalitarian movements in the early 20th century as the inarticulate backward setting for the political life of the nation. Those were the people who either who the existing parties took for granted. They believed that they represented for them. They represented those the masses, or maybe the masses had nothing else to say that needed to be represented. And Arendt said, and in that neglect, you push them towards fascism. But so I think it's dangerous to make the assumption that people will just go back to not voting. For a more fundamental and lasting change in the balance between the ideologies of racism, nationalism, and individualism, I think we would have to rely on that. Durkheim's faith in increased differentiation. To put it simply, we would need a rising proportion of graduates in all of these countries. We would need it to continue rising. We would need other developments in education and training which extended the offer of individualism beyond graduates. But I mean, is that really what anybody wants? To put this quote from Curtis up at the end, because I don't know on what basis. Maybe he took something from his complexity analysis to justify this. He says that the age of the individual led to disempowered individuals all wanting something different, but with no idea of how to get it. But I think something else is going to come along soon, a new kind of politics which allows you to be an expressive individual, but also part of something that's bigger than yourself. And do we want an individualism which is so thin, so paper thin, that it can mean just that you get to choose the music in your call center to one person, that you get to dress down on a Friday? I mean, all of those people who work in hospitality or catering or in retail, the people who work in supermarkets, who come out as they go onto the shop floor, they pass those motivational messages telling them that they're on stage. All of this seems to me to be a far cry from the individualism that those great 19th century social movements had in mind. And of course, what they were is the individual, as Curtis says in his quote, part of something that's bigger than yourself. Maybe now we do have an opportunity to reinvent the ideology of individualism by taking our inspiration from those great 19th century movements, the things that are bigger than ourselves. They were all about the opportunity, that those who were left out of the opportunity to be themselves, and those ideas, as we know, were applied to the people who had espoused them. So the working class who had supported the abolition of the slave trade eventually agitated for their own rights as employees, and then their democratic rights. But where's the evidence then? Where is the social movement that's coming forward to do this, to help us reinvigorate the idea of individualism? Well, I didn't know in 2016 when I last said this, and I still don't know. I mean, I was enormously thrilled to see the Black Lives Matter movement gather pace around the world. It reached far beyond people of color in the US. It was a really strong campaign in many countries, which was reminiscent of 19th century social movements. But at its core, it's just a restatement of the classic idea of every human life being sacred. And I'm not sure yet we can claim that there is any movement around that is having a major impact on the idea of individualism, on reclaiming the ideas of individualism from neoliberalism. For me, the key is the extent to which social movements can nurture beliefs about that, well, as Curtis puts it, about self-expression or the capacities of individuals. And that's why I've got the I'm finishing now, but that's the little picture. There's an extract, a slice of the picture on the cover of my book. It's heavy satire of Oscar Wilde, the Irish writer who was visiting San Francisco at the time, who I suppose more than anybody else writing in English, wrote the best description of individualism as a kind of as self-expression. This sunflower was his kind of sign for it, that people should express themselves. The heavy satire in the picture is that if you look in the middle of the sunflower, you see a dollar sign, because Oscar Wilde was visiting San Francisco to be paid for his talks, and how the editor of the magazine which published this cartoon, how could this hypocrisy not undermine Wilde's message of individualism? For me, that kind of sums up the problem that we've got here with the way that neoliberalism has taken over individualism, and somehow we need to wrest such an important ideology away from it right now. I don't know how. Perhaps you do. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ralph, for your conference. We are very grateful. It was a encompassing, dense, rigorous, and didactic, in some a very enlightening talk. Thank you so much for it. And well, considering that this was a little bit longer than expected, although understandable considering the nature of the issue, I ask you about the possibility of extending a little bit, maybe for some 30 minutes or so. I don't know how your time is being managed about it, because we have lots of questions and interactions from the audience. And I have also some questions of mine, couple of questions. Oh, how about you, Ralph? Do you still have a little bit time for it?
Yes, of course. It's my fault that I overran the time. So yes, I'm only too happy to stay on.
All right, so let's do it then. I will catch them by a block of 3. Is that okay for you?
Sure.
All right. So I will start with questions of my own as a moderator, and then I will pass by to the questions of the audience. And as I said, there is lots of questions and comments. I will try to filter them by issue, by subject. Well, on my end, I have 3 questions. The first one is the following. You talk about sentimental individualism as being previous to Industrial Revolution. And this somehow reminds me, Professor Jackson was saying this before the beginning of the talk, a recalling of Weber's Spirit of Capitalism somehow in actualization of this debate. And I got struck with this idea when Professor Jackson said that, because somehow your debate here today move us to think about a kind of spirit of individualism somehow, maybe. And on that grounds, if we remember, for example, because the 3 of the classics in sociological theory somehow works upon individualism, as just present about Durkheim, for example. But if we remember about Marx relates individual and property. So individual is a kind of ideal, abstract, or legal form of property within the birth of industrial capitalism. So as it is, it's an ideology, a massification, so to speak. On the side of Weber, individualism, in that case, coming from Protestantism, as it is at the same time a condition of possibility and at the same time, it is individualism in relation of selective affinity with what he calls the spirit of capitalism. And finally, Durkheim presents individualism, as you said, as the upcoming moral, functional to division of labor within growing differentiated societies. So in light of that, I want to know, what is the relation of individualism and structural socioeconomic change in your own account here? Because, again, you said before that it was before Industrial Revolution. So somehow social movements, expressions, and religiosity somehow made the ground for individualism, not structural, material, economic, so to speak, or socioeconomic change. So in that sense, I would like to hear a little bit more on how you see this relation, as the classics points this different way, but also the contemporary authors of sociological theory. I would like to understand a little bit more your position on this relation. That is the relation of individualism and structural socioeconomic change throughout history. The second one is, you say sentimental individualism was somehow subverted by cognitive individualism within the development of capitalism, ultimately leading to neoliberalism. So sentimental individualism is pictured as progressive, as egalitarian. So on that, the following queries. Is the enforcement of sentimental individualism the political answer to the fight on inequality and regressive neoliberal outcomes? How do you see this on political terms? Or there is a regressive phase to the sentimental individualism as well? And here I recall of, for example, Nancy Fraser's debate on what she calls progressive neoliberalism and how it was important for the taking hold of neoliberalism within public sphere and so on and so forth. And finally, you talk about a hybrid kind of individualism within neoliberalism. And here I'm somehow recall of Polanyi's double movements. And we can remember that Keynesianism and welfare state are not anti-liberal on this sense, they are just different forms of liberalism, right? So this hybrid kind of individualisms somehow could recall of Polanyi's double movement, going to cognitive from sentimental and from sentimental to cognitive. How do you think of these dialectics between sentimental and cognitive individualism within the current conjuncture of neoliberalism? Because it's clear by this time, and you talk a lot about the discontents of neoliberalism, that is a different conjunction than that of triumphant neoliberalism of the 80s, 90s, and the beginning of the 2000s. Neoliberalism is now maybe at crisis. I mean, subjective crisis, not only material economic one, as you know. Is there a crisis of neoliberalism or a neoliberalism of crisis? And in light of that, how could you place this dialectics between these two types of individualism within this current conjunction? Because you mentioned the problems of the left in Europe, but here in Latin America, we have revolts in Chile, Colombia right now, I hope so in Brazil. So, and it would be interesting to hear from you a little bit more about that. So I pass it through you now, and then I collect more questions from the audience and comments as well after you answer this first round. Thanks, Rob.
Well, as usual, Perna, you made me think a lot. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer any of those questions really. But if I go back to the first one, which is essentially a question about structure and culture, I think. I mean, Okay, so individualism, I think of as a wave that sweeps over Western culture. It begins before the Reformation, but it certainly gathers pace with the Reformation. So we're talking about very early modern Europe here, which, of course, the Reformation has structural characteristics and so subsequently does the Enlightenment. And I don't really think in this instance that I would need to say any more than there's a feedback loop between the changes that culture helps to support in say the economy or in polity, without saying where it. I don't think it's, for me, it doesn't matter so much where it started. I mean, there are works of individualism that going back, much further. Individual works. There were certainly parts of societies around the world that practiced their own versions of individualism long before the ideas were spread as they were in the Protestant Reformation. So I don't know whether I think I'm trying to dodge the question and think about that one, Baranal, but I do see it in terms of feedback loops. So that the culture changes the structure then makes possible the change in culture once more. I mean, you have to have the education system change in order to make it possible for people to achieve differently in the schools. You have to reach certain levels of affluence before you can have people living long enough to be able to think about expressing themselves very, very much. I think I'll ask you again about the second question for just a little bit more clarity on that one. But the third one about the double movement, I agree entirely about that. But how are the dialectics working out? Well, your end of it sounds far more interesting than mine. I mean, you tell me how the dialectics are working out, and whether anything about the framework that I've presented here helps to make sense of what's happening in Latin America. I mean, certainly if I look at around Europe, I find nothing so exciting. I mean, we do seem to have reached a bit of an impasse here. I mean, in France, for example, I can see that the only way that the neoliberal party of Macron is going to stay in power will be by, again, relying on the second votes of people who would vote for other parties if they could, but in the second round of presidential voting, they'll have to vote for Macron to keep out Marine Le Pen, which is it's where we were for the last presidential election in France. The Conservatives in the UK have had their transformation to being very sceptical about neoliberalism in some respects, but to the extent in which they'll be able to pull that off, I don't know. I mean, this is really why I didn't feel able to say anything particularly to back up my hopeful stance at the end of the talk. I think I want to know more about what's happening in countries that I don't understand. So I think can I ask you? I mean, is it the Latin American revolts? I mean, is there anything about that recalls the kind of social movements that I was talking about at the end of the talk? Or is it,
in Chile, certainly in Chile, for example, because it was started from the beginning as a questioning of the educational system, for example, and neoliberalism, social structures that were inherited from the Pinochet period, and they're right now having a striking victory within a constitutional assembly. That is, I mean, there's a huge majority of the forces of the left that there is just about to reform the Chilean state on the grounds that is necessary to free out of neoliberalism, Pinochet structures of the state. It's one example, but we also have Bolivia, for example, when they try to out Evo Morales of power, and then his successor took in within a new election. And now Colombia, with the streets are on fire against the current government, based on the revolt against a reform on pension systems, neoliberal reform mainly. So it's just three brief examples of what is happening right now in Latin America. And unfortunately, not in Brazil, but in Colombia, Bolivia, and Chile. But we can discuss further on that on the coming sessions, I guess, because I have to move to the questions of my dear colleagues from the audience. And so I'll do it. I'll try to move following the order that they appeared. The first one is from Lincoln, and Lincoln asks, and for the audience, I would say that I will concentrate myself on the questions, because there is lots of comments. You, Ralph, can check on the comments later, because it is all going to be online, available on YouTube, recorded. So it's possible also to access the comments. If you have some time to spare on that, I will also read the comments, but I will concentrate myself on questions. Okay? So let's begin with Lincoln. Lincoln asks, I saw the favorite talks a little about the role of the workplace in the formation of individualism. How does the professor see the role of the production models in it? For example, Fordism or Taylorism and Taylorism models. Somehow you touched this aspect in the end of your talk, right, Ralph? But anyway, it's a question coming from Lincoln. Then we have some comments. And then a question from Rodrigo Santaella, who asks, in a paper, you discuss individualism in 4 countries, US, UK, Singapore, and Portugal. Do you have any hypothesis about what type of individualism has been forged in Latin American countries? And followed by this question, I have a comment coming from Professor Roberto Briceño León, who is a visiting professor here at the UFC. He's a Venezuelan sociologist of violence, a very important one. Professor Roberto is asking, I got the impression that the 3 types of individualism are represented in Latin America, but in different social groups, each with its own type of individualism. Quite interesting comment on this behalf. And I guess 2 questions and 1 comment, so I will collect 1 question more. Antonio asks, as a psychologist, I wonder what other effects individualism may have on people. In your article, we see its influence on education. But for instance, what kind of effects it might have on identity? Can we close this block now, Ralph, and we answer, and then we move to another one? Okay, it's yours.
Wow. So a couple of questions about the workplace. Yeah, the Fordism, Taylorism, mass manufacturing, the American model at the beginning of the 20th century is a pretty good fit with the economic individualism that John Dewey described. I mean, you go out and work hard, and you get your money, and you keep your job. Was the deal, and it then informed what we, looking back on it now, call economic nationalism, with its economic champions like the Ford Motor Company, General Motors, the rest of it. So the deal is, you will be looked after if you keep carrying on your contribution to in the workplace. And it's a model that American capitalism finds very limiting in terms of the possibility of productivity gains. The way to increase productivity is to tell people that they will be rewarded as individuals, not as fodder for the assembly line, interchangeable workers who come through the factory gates every morning, who are, as Ford did, if you pay them enough, if you pay them a higher, if you pay them a higher rate than the rest of the employers, you can expect their productivity. Well, the basis of neoliberal employment relations is not that. It's the idea that you treat people as individuals in order to get more productivity out of them, in order for them to drive themselves, which does relate to the second point. Something I talk about in the book is the extent to which there is evidence, and sometimes there's more. When you actually look into it, the evidence can be a little bit slippery. But is there evidence of mental health problems created by people's commitment, by people's involvement in high commitment workplaces? The way that Curtis says that they take on they take it on their shoulders. They take responsibility for all of this. And certainly there's quite a literature which argues that is the case, that the effects of the hybrid individualism in the workplace, all of the expectations of self-actualization in return for harder and harder work, more and more commitment, more and more hours, has a debilitating effect on people's mental health. And of course, it exacerbates the problem of identity, because your identity, the more your identity is up to you, the more that is also a pressure, the more that is also something that a project in Foucault's terms that you have to engage on. I don't have any comment on the idea of different types in Latin individualism, except I'm fascinated to hear it, and the idea of different types of individualism in different social groups. I think that, however, I don't think is just. I don't think that's peculiar to Latin America. I think that's certainly in much of the literature on individualism in education and child rearing around the world, including in the United States. I mean, in fact, I was looking for a little video clip I had that would have been a companion piece for those pictures from the mall in Beijing, which was from the year before. I couldn't find it. It was a video of some kids sitting on the floor in the National Art Gallery in Beijing, copying the paintings all around them. It was an exhibition of British art that was very popular in Beijing at the time, and the floor was just covered with little kids who were copying the pictures that they were seeing on the walls, or taking little. And there were adults there, of course, who were helping them to do this, as part of, not that they were expected to become artists, but this was their appreciation of Western art was being, this was being. They were being taught to do this by trying to reproduce the pictures. Now, those were very middle class kids and very, very middle class parents, and it was Beijing, and it wasn't, you know, some other cities. I mean, yes, of course, you know, there are different mixes of individualism, different kinds of individualism in different social strata. That's right, and I would be fascinated to learn about how those differences play out in Venezuela or other Latin American countries.
Many thanks, Rafa. I'll move on to the next questions. I have one more here from Gabriela, who is saying that she has a question that is related with that of Rodrigo concerning neoliberalism and individualism in Latin America. And she says that in Latin America, the neoliberalism is largely connected with the exploitation of agricultural commodities in the rural part of the countries. And according of what she saw in the Netflix series Trapped, it also happened in Iceland, for example, too. But at the same time, people who live in those places usually have a more collectively way of living in a different relation with nature. Could you talk a little bit of these two ways of rationality that sometimes are put at the same site? So this was Gabriela's questions. Then I moved to Professor Andrea's question. She asks, is cognitive individualism not a matter of historically constructed habitus, also national? And she continues, is it possible to think of transnational individualism? Then we have another question of Antonio. I will mix the other ones. Antonio asks, I also have the impression that individualism is rather related to narcissism. So it can be both positive and negative. Do you see any relationship between individualism and narcissism? And then the last one on this block, I'll try to cope with one question more of Gabriela's, and she asks, according with Bourdieu and Vacan, multiculturalism and identitarism in the US was a way of spreading neoliberalism in the country and around the world as a cultural imperialism throughout think tanks and public politics. Could you talk about the relation between identitarism, think tanks, state, and neoliberalism? And this somehow, Ralph, relates to the second question that I made concerning some possible regressive aspects of expressive sentimental individualism as well as underpinned neoliberalism, not only cognitive individualism. And I guess with this we close up this block, and then we have, I guess, one more to one final more block of questions after that. So it's on you now.
Well, again, I'm not sure that I can do justice to all of these. Let's start with one that I think I feel a bit more confident about. The idea of transnational. So is it? Are we talking when we're talking about individualism? Are we talking about national habitus? How about transnational individualism? Well, I thought that would be. I think the product of transnational social movements in the 19th century. So the ideas were developed in the abolitionist movement in the UK were then exported to the United States. I mean, you can track the history of it, the way that those ideas were imported into the US. Similarly, so with the later 19th century movement. So obviously, the Protestant Reformation was an international movement, which spread the ideas of religious individualism, the idea that individuals are responsible for their own salvation, but therefore that everybody had a soul, and that they ought to be able to have the chance to do whatever was needed in order to ensure that they could save their souls. It was international. Neoliberalism and the exploitation of agricultural resources, of I guess more than that. I mean, other things like mining in Australia, or rare metals in Africa, and the people who are in those areas, who have a different relationship to the world. I'm not sure that mine. I mean, they see it, and it's really interesting. And I'm sure it's true that there is a neoliberal phase to that exploitation of the natural environment. But obviously, it is something that's been going on for an awful lot longer. I mean, I did have, not in this book, but in a previous iteration, I did have more as a thought experiment of using the environmental movement as a way of thinking about how social movements change our thinking. But I don't think that is particularly relevant to the as interesting as it is, important as it is. I don't think it's particularly relevant to individuals. I mean, I can see the point that the people who live in Amazonia, for instance, don't think about necessarily think about individualism in the same way that people in other parts of Brazil do. I'm not sure how the theory I'm developing here helps to explain that any better. Perhaps I need to think about it. Narcissism, of course, it's been in and around this literature since, I mean, before Christopher Lasch, I suppose. But famously in his work, so much so important was that the stuff from the US in the 70s and 80s, that the ruling party in Singapore latched onto it as one of the problems about Western individualism, was that it would encourage narcissism, and they took fright at the idea. So it's played a political role around the world. I mean, I would guess also in other countries where there's a large proportion of the Chinese population. A large proportion of the population Chinese, as they are in Singapore, Chinese immigrants. The question of identitarianism, I think there's really a broader question there. I mean, and you related it to your idea of the expressive is regressive, which is a nice little slogan I've written down here. Think of it a little bit more broadly. I mean, we have we have all of these legal supports for individualism, universal human rights, and all of its offshoots, the UN Declaration of Children's Rights. We have in individual countries the legal support for individual employment relations, and none of it works very well. The equal opportunities legislation doesn't work very well. There's still structural discrimination. There's still endemic racism in Western countries. There's still a patriarchy. There's still women who suffered far worse in the course of the pandemic than men. I mean, in the UK, it wasn't just women, of course, who suffered in the pandemic, but also Black and Asian minority ethnic groups did as well. Not just suffering in terms of excess deaths, and so equality of opportunity is maybe it's one of those things, along with all of the other things, the rights-based framework. It's a bit like the way that people experience individualism at work, or you remember my little anecdote about the health and safety at work policy. Well, they must have it, mustn't they? Because there's been this very persuasive story told about equality and valuing people is a necessary adjunct of productivity, of increasing productivity, of being more efficient. You have to get the best people for the job. You have to so I kind of think in that respect then identity politics is a little bit of a distraction from what we should be really focusing on, which is the extent to which the earlier aims of social movements were translated into laws, into practices, and then we were told that the job was done. Whereas, in fact, most of the work remains to be done. There's an awfully depressing anecdote about the way that the British enforced the abolition of the slave trade. And I won't go into the details, but it led to people who were caught on the high seas with slaves in their ships throwing the slaves overboard. So the way that the abolition was enforced actually produced the opposite of what the abolitionists had hoped for. So identity politics, to the extent that it diverts our attention from the fundamental problems that we were trying to grapple with when these social movements were of a different kind, like I do. I think I probably agree with you that there is a regressive, or if not a regressive element, there's a distraction.
All right. So thanks again. We move to the final, and I ask you. Apologies for that. The longest, I guess, block, because we must finish considering the late hour. So I will try to catch up a little. A bigger number of questions, right? Maybe 4 or 5, but I guess it will ask a little bit more on your patience to take note and to respond to this. Let's do it. The first one is from Márcio Peixoto, and Márcio asks, thinking about the progressively broader range of evidence used as public certifications of individual progression, do you think that when it comes to social minorities in the cultural and mediatic spheres, the few examples of success that get to reach variable, visible spaces become also public evidence, in this case, very illusory ones, of how neoliberalism is allegedly bringing social progression into our societies? Beyond that, do these few cases of individual visibility set up a formula for individual success that compromises the whole idea of individualism and differentiation? So there was a question from Márcio. And then we move to the question coming from Oscar. And Oscar asks the following. If we understand neoliberalism as an authoritarian expression of liberalism aimed at diminishing the power of working class, for which cognitive individualism is useful, but also repression, couldn't we understand the ascent right-wing and nationalism phenomena as an coherent intensification of the liberal governmentality, which implies both authoritarianism and individualism. And then we have some comments coming from Professor Andrea, thanking you for the conference, also from Professor Christian, a professor of our graduate program as well, stating that it was a very interesting lecture. And finally, some more two questions. This one coming from Eric, and Eric asks, I have two questions, not only one, Ralph, sorry. First one, about sentimental individualism. Seeing, as you cite some terms and authors of Republican tradition, how it is related to humanism, your discussion, I guess. The second one is about your choice to name this kind of individualism cognitive individualism. Have you given any thought to the individualistic epistemology, by which I mean the emphasis on isolated individuals as being to determine validity of facts and information by employing their individual reasoning? I guess Eric is also talking about solipsism, maybe. And then comments, and now the final question coming from Marisa Neres. And Marisa asks, I would like to ask Professor Favre, if Professor Favre sees the cultural impacts, or how Professor Favre, see the cultural impact of individualism on the low classes and on all those people who are marginalized in the context of neoliberalism. You talk about little about this in your conference, also in your paper, but Marisa asks, again, on the cultural impacts of individualism on the low classes and all those people who are marginalized in the context of neoliberalism. So with that, we end our questions. You have the floor to answers, and the Q&A question is over with your final answers and remarks.
Again, these are very interesting, and I don't necessarily have good answers to them. I think the first one, which is the point about the few individuals who manage to make it through social mobility, are held up as evidence of well, look how individualism works for them, because they took advantage of the opportunities that are available, and how that then legitimizes increases in inequality. Yeah, I mean, this is not limited to neoliberalism. I mean, this was early 19th century liberalism in the UK. Samuel Smiles wrote a famous book called Self-Help, which was a bestseller at the time, which is all stories about how people from lowly backgrounds had risen up to become entrepreneurs, to make something of themselves. Of course, in the US, the cult of the self-made man was I guess even more influential. And yes, it's absolutely right. As well as the notion that because it's based in reason and evidence, and because it's fundamentally egalitarian in that everybody can compete for education, then the ideology then, for its completion, also requires that you have some successes. You can point to some people who have managed to make it. I mean, this is a problem actually. For it used to fascinate me for a few years how not just British but sociology of education kind of couldn't really get around this problem. That we used to spend a lot of time thinking about, saying we, but I wasn't always involved in sociology of education, but they worrying about the people who didn't make it, who didn't learn from the manual of self-help? So why was it the case that they hadn't been able to take advantage of it? So sociology of education used to go in for a lot of cultural explanations, and I think it's only latterly that it's become more common for people to accept that actually the system is meant to increase and reproduce inequality. That's what it's there for. The question about the authoritarianism of neoliberalism, I mean, I guess it does look different in different parts of the world, and I said a little bit today about the reception of neoliberalism in China. We touched on it there in relation to the exploitation of commodities. Certainly, I know about a little bit, only a very little bit about that in relation to Latin America. That isn't how it's been perceived by the people who have supported neoliberalism in the most affluent countries, and they certainly don't see the kind of thing that's advocated by those generals in France or by Viktor Orban as being an intensification of what we had before. I mean, there's still a great deal of resistance, even to the what shall I call them, the minor illegalities. Well, yeah, call them authoritarianism, but the minor illegalities of the current government in the UK. There's still a great deal of resistance to that from the people who had most invested in neoliberalism. So I guess it's it's just part of this story about how it looks different in different parts of the world. And it reminds me of not to be too ethnocentric in my generalizations. The point about sentimental individualism and humanism. In the United States, I think we often forget just how important religion was to the what I think John Hyam called the American ideology. I mean, this was Protestant ideology at its core, and very much aimed at re-educating the immigrants who came from Catholic countries in Europe, the Irish, the Poles, the Italians, who were to be taught American Republican virtues, but religious, not humanist virtues. And it's still remarkable to us in Europe how even now that religious heritage plays a part in American politics. The point about epistemology and solipsism, you thought, Parana, perhaps. I mean, of course, it is an epistemology, isn't it? How we know things. Do we know things because we believe in them, or because we require evidence, we require our reason, we require evidence of our five senses, or I don't know, something else, social surveys, body scans, whatever. I guess that's something we can certainly talk about in our course over the. I'm assuming Eric is one of our students. Is that right?
I guess so. Yeah, I guess so. I'm not sure, but I guess so.
So hopefully I'll be talking to him directly over the next couple of weeks. Yes, so we finish up with the impact of neoliberalism on the lower classes has been, as Sennett and Cobb once said, the hidden injuries of class. I remember going to do an interview in a Welsh steel town in the 1980s as the recession was taking hold, as the effects of Thatcher's neoliberal reforms were taking effect on manufacturing industry, and so there's a long time before most of the things that I think most people will point to as evidence of neoliberalism in the UK. And this young father was bemoaning the fact that he was going to have to encourage his kids to do well at school, which to me, you know, from my background in education, just sounded like a different world. But of course, what he was describing was this different world that had suddenly appeared in front of his eyes, because, you know, the decade before, there had been 20,000 well-paying jobs at the local steelworks. And the only question was, did you know somebody there well enough to be able to get yourself a skilled job, or would you have to have the unskilled job? But in any case, this was going to be well paid, and it was as far as you knew, going to be a job for life. Mostly for men, almost all for men, of course, not for women. And suddenly, that had all gone. And this bloke was saying, oh, and you know, the kids will have to do well at school, which he had never done. He'd never had to. He'd left without qualifications and got a job, and now things had changed. And he didn't understand it. And what's more, he didn't think it was going to last. He said to me, you know, how long do you think this will last for? When will we get back to the situation when we had our jobs guaranteed by the state because of our nationality, because of our race, because of our gender? And I think it's that revanchism, that wanting to go back, that has powered some of the deep resentments that have been expressed in the votes for Brexit and you know, the Gilets jaunes and, you know, all these other movements around Europe. But nevertheless, the injuries are real. You know, you are told the game has changed in a way that disadvantages you, and the disadvantage you suffer is your own fault. And to many people, that just it not only makes no sense. It's like an existential threat. There's so, you know, I think you can understand. I mean, maybe I overdo it a bit with the comparisons to Hannah Arendt, who was talking about, you know, mass unemployment and massive economic dislocation. But certainly there's been dislocation of a very serious kind at the heart of the countries that have spread the neoliberal message around the world.
On that, I remember the late moves of Ken Loach, maybe quite elucidative on the reality that you just presented.
Ken Loach, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right, Ralph, thank you so much for this. I ask you if you have some final remarks, concluding remarks in order to, end the session.
Do you know, I think not. I better not say anything else, but except thank you to everybody for their questions and comments, particularly the stuff about Latin America. I've obviously got a lot to learn, and in my collaboration with you and the colleagues in the university. So I hope to learn some of those lessons in the weeks to come.
Yeah, I hope so too. It was a fantastic conference, fantastic debate. Thanks once more for that. It also gives us, I hope, some taste on what is about to come in your course in the coming weeks. And for each, I thank you again for so generously engaging yourself with us here at UFC. And I also hope that not only today at the conference, but in the coming sessions of our course, it is going to be so productive for you as it is being productive for us. Thank you so much once more. And thank you all for your presence, your comments and questions, for being with us until this time. Thank you so much. See you for those who are inscribed within the course next week. And for those who not, I wish you a great academic semester. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice day.